And we are. And we're recording. Um, so welcome to the February meeting of the Scarlet Quill Society, where we're going to be talking about what you can do before you start editing. I'm Ronan? I'm Rowan in my pronouns, which rhymes really nicely, are she or they. There are 7 animals in this house, all of which will probably make an appearance at some point, so be prepared for that. If your animal makes an appearance at some point, be prepared to cameo your animal because that's great. We love that. Let's see. I am putting my notes over here, and sometimes they're very large, and it's kind of startling to me. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this Weimaraner and why she's making this noise. Would you like a treat, honey? Is that what you need? Okay. Thank you for joining our meeting. So why should you do things before you start writing? Because editing is not your favorite part. I mean, that's the simplest answer, is that writing is, there's so many memes rolling around about, like, I love having written and I hate writing, and when I'm reading my story and then I realize I stopped writing it and I get mad because there isn't more to read. That is definitely something that's happened to me a lot, and I wish that jerk would finish writing those stories. But the editing part is not necessarily anybody's favorite part, even me, and I do it for a living, but if it was my favorite part, maybe I wouldn't have to get paid for it. So there's a bunch of stuff that we can do that's going to save us time and effort editing later. We're not going to have to go back in and yank out a whole bunch of stuff about a character. We're not going to have to go back in and rework our timeline. We're not going to suddenly realize that one character is in 2 different places at the same time. I have a friend who writes, and one of my jobs as her editor is to go through and make sure her character's hair isn't becoming curly. She will write beautiful, beautiful descriptions, consistently gorgeous descriptions, and the minute she has to write about a character's hair doing anything, like if it's blowing in the wind or if it's escaping, or she's doing this like wonderful show don't tell thing, where like the hair and the dress are doing something, the character's hair suddenly magically becomes curly no matter how she described it prior. And so, like, knowing who has curly hair and who doesn't immediately while you're writing those descriptions is going to save me as your editor a ton of time later. So the first thing that you can do for yourself is your text setup. And I think that we don't talk enough about the way that tech can kind of rescue us from ourselves. I get these ads on Facebook, and I don't know if anybody else is getting these ads on Facebook, where it's like this thing that used to be Jarvis until obviously Disney found them and sued them for copyright. It's like, I'm an AI and I can write all your blog posts for your business. And I'm like, no, you can't. No, you can't. Tech is never going to replace us as writers. It's not going to sound good. It's not going to sound natural. You're going to spend as much time editing that AI's blog posts as you are not. But there are things that we can do with the technology that we have that save us a ton of time later editing. And the first one, and the one that, like, I think we all know about but nobody really thinks about, is spell check. And spell check is like, I turn off grammar check, not going to lie, because I like to write these long, complex sentences that go a lot of places, and they've got these semicolons, these em dashes, and if you run it through something like Grammarly or Hemingway, especially Hemingway, which is like, Hemingway says it edits your writing for conciseness, but all it does is count the number of words between periods, which is not necessarily optimal if you don't know how to construct a sentence, or if you don't want all your sentences to sound the same. But if you run my sentences through one of those programs, they're a nightmare. They're just like nothing but squiggle underlines. But spell check will protect you from a lot of errors, just spell check. And one of the areas that we don't think about spell check protecting us from is becoming that sort of dying wizard voice fantasy novel. There's a fairly famous XKCD comic about it, and like the number of made up words in your story. And so, like, as you're writing, one of the things that you can do is you just go through and add all your character names to your spell check. It takes you 10 minutes. If it's taking longer than that, you may have too many characters to keep track of, and spell check will be saving you from yourself. If adding all of your made up words to spell check is taking a really long time, spell check is saving you from having something that, like, you then have to have this huge glossary in the back, and you're asking a lot from your readers at that point. This is not the same. I want to be really, really clear. This is not the same as using words that do not appear in standard American English. This is not the same as adding, if your character speaks in a vernacular, saying finna or gotta. This is not the same as needing to add a bunch of words in Spanish or a bunch of words in French or a bunch of words in Finnish that are appropriate words for your book or your story or whatever. Your memoir, right? Like, depending on your background, you may need to include a lot of non-English words in your memoir. Don't worry about how long that takes. Go ahead and add them, though, because your editor or your beta reader, especially your beta reader, if you're in sort of an informal beta reading agreement with somebody, is not necessarily going to be competent to catch those words. The other thing it will save you from doing is spelling your same character's name 5 different ways. I edited a book for someone a couple years ago who had a character who literally changed names. They just changed a vowel. 80,000 words into a 300,000 word thing, which is, it's a ridiculously long thing. But I'm going to apologize if the mic is picking up a lot of dog whining. She's really good at whining. It's good to play to our strengths. So spell check will save you. The other thing that will save you is that autosave button. Set your autosave for as short a period of time as your computer will permit you to do without bogging down entirely. My autosave is set at 2 minutes. If my power goes out, I do not lose more than 2 minutes of work. There is nothing sadder than trying as a writer and an editor to reconstruct 2.5 hours of writing that you are 100% sure had some of the most beautiful sentences you ever wrote in it, and now they're gone. We say kill your darlings, but having your darlings murdered for you is something entirely different, and it should never happen to anyone. It's the saddest thing in the universe. Another tech thing that you can do that helps you is write in a program that you like. Some people love Scrivener, some people love Word, some people love Google Docs, bless their hearts. I do not love Google Docs. I'm just going to front that. I hate Google Docs. I hate it as a writer, and I hate it as an editor. I don't like that its versioning is really bad. Its tracking changes is really bad. The fact that it wants to talk to you every time somebody makes a comment or does a change is incredibly frustrating, and it bogs everything down. And it's frankly, if you're going to submit a manuscript at some point, you're going to end up taking that out of Google Docs and putting it into Word anyway, because if you are not writing in one of the standard programs that editors are expecting to see the manuscript submitted in, you're going to have to move it into that before you can submit. So you might as well just write it in the same program anyway, right? You might as well start, because then you don't lose your formatting. You don't have to go back through. If you have, a 60, 70, 80-page manuscript, you don't want to have to go through that at the end of the day and make sure that all of your quotes are the right quotes. You just don't want to. And those are things that pop out, and they are things that make your work look less polished and less publishable. And at the end of the day, submissions editors are human, right? They're going to judge you based on something. And if what they're judging you based on is the fact that you had to convert your Google Doc into a Word doc at the last minute and all of the quotes are wrong, all of your ellipses are screwed up, and your font changes sizes 5 times, they're going to judge you on that. It's going to be harder to read. We want to make their lives easier. The happier the submissions editor is, the better the shot you have. That's, at the end of the day, excuse you. As a submissions editor, I did my best. All the submissions editors I know do their best, but we are only human beings. And if there are 2 stories in front of us of equal merit and one of them hasn't pissed us off, that's the one that's going in. Playlists. Honestly, if you like to write to playlists, get those made beforehand, because otherwise you're going to be like sitting down to write and you're going to be frustrated and you're going to be hitting skip and it just takes up a bunch of time. And every time you look away, every time you stop thinking about the sentence that you're writing, it's going to take you time to get back into it. And right now, especially, we're all writing in this sort of time confetti. You've got an hour here and an hour there. And even people like me who are lucky enough to work from home and be able to more or less set our own schedules, I'm still finding that my time has gotten a lot more chunked up since the start of the pandemic, just because people expect you to be available more at different times. So I might have 3 hours to work on a client project in the morning, and then an hour and a half to work on something of mine, and then another 2 hours to work on a client project, and then I've got a conference call. And every time I look away from my own writing and look back, I've lost 5 minutes of my hour and a half that was all I had today. So the more things you can have streamlined coming in, the more writing time you have, and the less editing you have to do, because the less likely you are to go back and make those continuity errors in your story. Speaking of continuity errors, the next thing that I want to talk about is outlining. I'm going to front, I hate outlining. I am not an outliner. I am not a natural outliner. I am a pantser. I am a pantser of the Peter Beagle quality pantsness. And I don't know if everybody's heard the sort of iconic story of how Peter Beagle is writing The Last Unicorn, and I'm sorry if there are spoilers in this. The movie's 30 years old. The book's even older. We're going to be fine. We're going to get through this together emotionally. All of the unicorns in the world have disappeared. We have our little intrepid group of adventurers that's looking for these unicorns, and we are probably 20 pages from the end of the book, and Peter Beagle still doesn't know where the unicorns are until the characters open up this clock in the dark castle, and they go behind the clock, and he's like, oh, there's only one place left in the world the unicorns could possibly be. And I'm like, okay, Peter Beagle, that was a little tense. And I do tend to write like that. I tend to write by throwing a bunch of characters into situations with things that the characters want. And then we reach a certain point and I'm like, okay, well, this is the next thing that has to happen. So with everything that's already happened, process of elimination says there's only one way to get from here to there. Okay, great. Now I know what the next 5 days are going to look like in this story. What do you need? Do you need to know what the next 5 days look like? So I'm sorry, she was not this needy last meeting, but she's having a moment today. So the thing is, even if you write like that, you can and should do outlining. It doesn't have to be super detailed. I have friends who write super detailed outlines of their whole novel before they even start writing. They've got stuff blocked out by scene, and they can write their novel out of order because they know what's coming. And so if they're like, I'm stuck on this scene, I'm just going to write this scene and then I can come back to this scene, that is never going to work for me. Ever, ever, ever. But I super respect people who can outline like that. It keeps your continuity continuous. If you can write this scene and you know what had to go into that scene, that's fantastic. That's so cool. I can't. So how detailed your outline should be kind of depends on who you are. I also know a lot of people who are like, well, if I sat down and wrote down the details of everything that was supposed to happen in every scene of my book, I would feel like I had already written my book. and then I wouldn't want to write it because I know everything that happens. Um, Stephen King referred to writing a book as trying to shoot a missile halfway around the world and drop the payload through a basketball hoop. And hypothetically, we can do it. Mathematically, we can do it. You can get a lot of people who will say that they can do it. But realistically, once you get within that like last 5 miles of the basketball hoop, it's kind of anybody's guess. On the other hand, if you put enough explosives in the missile, as long as you get close to the hoop, you're okay. And so that's kind of another valid outlining process. You mostly know where things are going to go. You know what happens after the denouement. You know who's still alive at the end of the book. You know who got together, who didn't get together. You don't necessarily know how that happened. It's okay to just have those couple of touch points. Do it for as much idea as you know. I get a lot of shower ideas. A lot of writers get a lot of shower ideas. Maybe you only get like sort of the next 2 scenes. It's fine to jot down 3 or 4 words about the next 2 scenes in the book. That's your outline. Just keep those all together so that you can kind of look back at them periodically and be like, okay, well, if this happened and this happened, then that can't happen. So I'm not going to spend a month writing this scene that can't happen that I'm then going to have to go back in and edit out later, and it's going to break my heart, again, with the darlings. The other thing that you can do that is still technically outlining, but not really outlining, especially if you pants, is keep a spreadsheet. As your characters pop up and as you find things out about your characters, and I'm going to use characters very loosely here because nonfiction has characters too. They're just like also people. But as your players enter the scenes, make a note of their name, how it's spelled, where they're from, whatever information you know about them. I have, let me see if this is the right, nope, that's my chronology. I have a sheet that is just like that. So people's hometowns don't change. So the number of siblings people have doesn't change. And this is all something, especially if you're writing like a longer work and you're going to have a pro editor touch it at the end. If you can hand them this, you are going to be their favorite person. If you can hand them something that shows them how everybody's name is supposed to be spelled, all of the things that they then don't have to keep in their head or ask you about later, like, oh, here you said that James had 5 siblings, and here you say he only has 2, which is correct. They don't have to come back to you about that. They've got a spreadsheet that says James has 2 siblings. They can just fix it where you say 5. So that kind of outline, that kind of less formal outline, is still super duper incredibly helpful. It lets you pull back periodically and think about the big picture. And when you have an eye on that big picture, you are less likely to make micro decisions that make some of the big picture stuff you need to have happen impossible. Not to pick on Twilight, although everybody picks on Twilight, so it's kind of a low-hanging fruit. There is a really important plot point in Twilight, which is that Bella is ostracized. She ends up hanging with the vampires because, like, everybody in her new school ostracizes her. They think that she's weird. They think that she's, and so on a macro level, that's on your outline, right? Like Bella, outcast, weird. People think she's clumsy and awkward and bookish, so that you then don't make the classic mistake that Stephanie Meyer made, which is on the micro level, every time she describes Bella, Bella's incredibly attractive and talented, and there's no reason that anyone wouldn't like her. So you don't end up with those conflicts that a good editor would have pulled out of that book. Yeah, so you can save yourself from those conflicts. You can save yourself from those editing, and you can save yourself from like coming to a workshop where people are like, this character feels really out of character every time you write them. Like the way that you describe them and the way they behave is just wildly like, are they the same person? Are we sure they're the same person? So yeah, you can absolutely just save yourself that time. The other thing that you want to do before you start is give your dog a whole entire giant handful of treats so that she isn't sad in her kennel. Yes, so exciting. Lean in. Research. And people always say, well, how much research should I do? How much is too much? How much? Because, like, who has not gone down that research rabbit hole where you're like, I need to know what kind of stone is on the seafloor. And the next thing you know, you're like, in the Cretaceous period. And then, like, you're sending memes about microbiology of the cetaceans to, like, your best friend, and it's 2 a.m, and they're like, number one, go to sleep, but number two, did you get anywhere on the book today? So there's generally the sweet spot is know more than your character and know enough that your readers think that you know what you're talking about. And the classic example that I use for this, I'm going to say classic example apparently 40 times because I did not write a detailed outline for this talk. But the classic example is I read a story. Oh God, it's probably, what is it? It's 2022 now. I must have read it in 2010 or 2011. I am still mad about it. I just need you to know I am still mad about it. They described the rolling green hills of the Idaho Panhandle. Now, the Idaho Panhandle is in the Rocky Mountains, and it is heavily forested. And Google Maps would have shown them, like 5 seconds with Google Maps would have shown them that they meant southern Idaho, and they did not, in fact, mean the Panhandle. And so that little bit of research. Another example that I like to use is we had a Super Challenge contestant write a story that was set in a small town that was very near the small town where another judge grew up. And they hadn't even done like a Google Street View of this town. So when they were describing it, this judge was just like, I don't trust anything in this story. Like, I'm trying really hard. I know that they picked this because it's supposed to be a small town, but I am only human. And I'm really struggling here because I know that they didn't do any research. And so now everything else in the story is sus. Which, you know, it doesn't take that much time. The absolute minimum that anyone should do right now is if you're writing in a real world place, there's so many really easy ways to go there, even if you can't physically go there. You get on Google, you go to Planet Earth View, you go to Street View, you see what kind of vegetation there is. Something that I like to do is I actually will put that place in the weather app on my phone so that I have a sense of how much warmer or cooler it is than where I am sitting and where I am writing. How often it rains. That's obsessive. I don't expect everyone to do that, but at least look up the rainfall and get a sense if that's more or less than you have. The habits of people who live in a high desert area where you are constantly yelling at each other to turn the water off because the well is going to dry up. Nobody leaves the water on when they're brushing their teeth. Especially if they're on a well. So, start with that kind of research. Spend some time with the history and geology of the area. Can you talk to somebody who is from there or from a similar area to there? Know enough to fool someone who knows a little bit, that you know at least as much as they do about it. And talking to people is research. Talking to people is research. And the other thing is that if you do this sort of basic level of research and you find that you cannot get a feel for this setting, you don't have to write in it. Not every idea that you have has to become a story. I realize that, like, as an editor and as a writer and as somebody who teaches writing and wants to be super encouraging, I would be like, yes, write all the things, write all the things. Don't write all the things. a lot of times there's just like, oh, I had that idea. That was a good idea. It's going to be a lot of effort to write this. Maybe somebody else can do a better job with it than me. Maybe I'll just kind of bring this to my workshop and just be like, hey, here's an idea I had. Does anybody want to actually write that part? This is especially true, and again, July, but this is especially true when you're talking about writing characters from backgrounds who are really different from yours, um, characters from regions that are really different from yours, stories that are set in cultures that are not a culture that you have a strong familiarity with. There are people in that culture who are telling stories. There's not going to be like no stories if you don't do it. It'll be fine. We're all going to make it. Somebody will tell that story. Sorry, I'm just going to drink this entire hour. Um, drink. I have coffee, I have Pepsi, and I think I have another can of soda here. Who talks to anyone, right? Like sustained talking is getting to feel like really strange now. Um, so circling back though to talking to people as part of your research, talking it out is one of the most amazing things that you can do for yourself and your story. Talking about it early. Um, one of our July panelists refers to it as keeping the internet from falling on your head. Um, the odds that you are going to say something or put out a story that embarrasses you significantly go down with every person you talk to. Um, you don't know what you don't know, right? Like just this morning, I was sort of talking out the last couple of talking points for this class, and I've taught it, I've talked about it, I've written posts about it. They asked a question, and it was something that was so completely like, I was like, oh, well, of course I should talk about that. Of course I should talk about this as a tool that we can use to help ourselves not have to do editing later. Why have I never talked about that before? I didn't know. It's not something that is in my life or my personal vocabulary of what I have to do to write. So I didn't think of it. Um, so get someone who's going to ask you questions. So many good questions. And I know in the last couple of days in the coffee house, we've had some great discussions and questions and people asking questions like, okay, well, do you know this about your story? Should you know that about your story? What I'm having a hard time getting a sense of this. What can you tell me? And that's going to tell you where you need to fill in holes. It's going to tell you what research you need to do. And if you need something, if somebody's getting an assumption about your story that you think isn't like something that you meant to put in, figure out where that came from and either put it in deliberately or don't put it in. Those are both options that you have, right? Know what people are getting out of your story. Before you give your really cool airship a super racist name accidentally, looking at me. Um, and thank you to the friend that I talked that out with for fixing that. The name itself wasn't super racist. It just evoked a long discussion in the industry that I should have known about, that I didn't know about. It's all better now. It was a 5-second change, but it was a lot of editing because I had to find every place I had used this name, and um, and because a lot of characters had different nicknames for the thing, it wasn't enough to just like do a search and replace. um, so that was not my favorite, couple hours of editing that I've ever spent, and I could have saved myself that trouble by talking to someone earlier. So the thing that I learned this morning that I needed to suggest to add, I actually should have slotted in under tech setup because this is something that we don't talk about a lot, but there are a lot of writers who have aphantasia, who cannot, who cannot visualize in their head exactly what's going on in a scene. Um, for people with aphantasia, if you say, imagine an apple in your mind's eye, a lot of them thought that that was just metaphorical language. I'm one of the people who cannot just imagine an apple in my mind's eye. I can assemble a 3D apple and rotate it and manipulate it and look at the seeds inside it. And I actually have trouble visualizing an apple because there are so many kinds of apples, and I need to know if I'm visualizing like a Macintosh or a Honeycrisp. Um, but I have a friend who cannot, like, no apple, nothing, not even the word apple. Um, so if she needs to put an apple in a story, she has to look up the apple. She has to look up what kind of apple it is, and then she has to save an image of the apple. I have another friend who struggles with descriptions, right? Like, so they have paper dolls, like basically not physical paper dolls, but like I don't know if anybody but me is old enough to remember color forms, but you would put these little like heads and bodies into a thing and put a piece of paper on it and rub a crayon over the top of it, and you could do a whole bunch of different sort of outfits by changing the top and the bottom. And it was like paper dolls, but it was like making a drawing on the paper doll. And so they do that, or they will have a Pinterest board where it's like, this is what everybody's wearing in this scene, this is what everybody's wearing in that scene. A lot of people with aphantasia will essentially fan cast their own stories. They will go through and find pictures of actors or models or stock photos of people with, you know, the ethnicity they want, the race they want, in the region of the world they want, maybe wearing traditional costumes, maybe not wearing traditional costumes. They will pull together this image dictionary that they can then go look at when they need to describe something, so that they don't need to visualize it in their head. I also have a friend who, when they are writing fight scenes or dance scenes or anything that has a lot of blocking where the characters are moving around in relationship to each other, but you need to know where they are, it's like actually important to know if they can like reach out and touch each other at a given moment. They will use one of the tabletop role-playing tools that actually puts a map, and you can like move furniture around in the map. And they say that they use the tabletop role-playing tools because they could draw it out on a grid, but those tools are already in place. They're easy to use. There's already a scale, and there's already all kinds of things that you can plug into them. So I cannot think off the top of my head of what tool necessarily they're using, but if I come up with it, I will go ahead and put it in the Scarlet Quill. I'm pointing to it like you can see it in the Discord. But there's just so many of them out there, and a lot of them are free, a lot of them are easy to use, a lot of them are plug and play. I also have a friend who just tacks a map to the wall and uses dry erase markers and calls it good, which is another very, very valid little Archie cameo here. The kittens are Archie Kennedy and Horatio Hornblower. Yes, they're named for the BBC miniseries. No, we will not be taking questions at this time. I understand how colonial that is, but they're little colonizer kittens. That just is what it is. So the last thing that I want to talk about is something that's going to save time that doesn't feel like it's saving time, and that's writing. And I call them side quests because I approach everything from a video game standpoint, because I'm a big old nerd. But a lot of people call them shorts, or they'll call them drabbles, which is a more or less technical term describing a length of story. I don't like calling it drabbles because I think a lot of these reach sort of outside the realm of what a drabble is or should be. But take your characters and do things with them that are not your main story. One thing that you can do that is phenomenally fun and useful is take something like, there's a bunch of daily prompts on Twitter. Yeah, right, we will throw down daily challenges in the Discord. Write to those prompts, but use your characters. Use your main character. You will find out something new about your character every time you write them. Every time you put them in a new situation. Stick that in your spreadsheet. You now know that. I once made a writer play two truths and a dare, or two truths and a lie, sorry, with her characters. I have made people play truth or dare with their characters. And you find out so much about it. If you just like sit down and kind of role play through it, grab a friend, say, hey, if you take this character and I take this character and we play truth or dare, I'm going to find out so much about, what kind of dare will this character tap out of? What won't they do? What did they think they were consenting to when they agreed to play truth or dare? What truths are they comfortable discussing about themselves? What truths did you not know? Because now you have a friend asking you these questions about your character, and you're like, oh, like, what is the biggest lie they ever told in school? Or what is the biggest fight they ever had with a significant other? Or, will they jump off a gym roof on a dare, or won't they? Will they just be like, well, no, that's stupid, let's like dial this back, or let's stop playing? So you find out more about that. The other thing that you can do is, I love transformative works. I love fan fiction. There is no possible way for a single universe book something to be enough. I always want more, especially if I enjoyed it. And I also really enjoy what a lot of people are doing with their fan works, that they are making them, more diverse. They're making them more consent forward. They're making the characters really, really interesting. But one of the other things that I talk about with transformative works is they always write these AU, alternate universe works. Take your characters and put them in a different situation. The tropes that we all love, the coffee shop AU. What if one of your characters was a barista? How would that work out? How would they meet your other characters? What would they do? Are they a coffee snob? Which one of your characters is the most likely to be a coffee snob? The high school AU, what role does each of these characters play? If you were rewriting Breakfast Club with your characters, could you do it? Do you have those tropes covered? Who's closest to what? What didn't you like about this? The bookstore, who's working in the bookstore? Who comes in? What do they need? As always, oh my God, they were roommates. So yeah. And the pornography set, that is a valid AU. If your characters are working in porn, what kind of porn are they making? Are they making porn together? Are they meeting outside? Who's on tech? What's going on? Who's the director? Who has ideas like that? So, just throw them into a completely different situation and see what they do, because I just don't think you can know your characters until you know what they're going to do in a couple of different situations. And knowing what they're going to do in those couple of different situations is going to save you so much time in your book trying to get them motivated to do something. If you find out that your character absolutely will not go somewhere that there's a spider or a snake, that's so useful to you, because every time you now need them to not go somewhere or not go into a room, just put a snake in it. You're fine. Put a snake in it. There's your reason for them not to go in there. You will find out what your characters want more than anything else. Does this character need parental approval? If so, how is that going to affect how they interact with the other characters? Knowing more about your characters is going to help you keep them in character. And again, that's going to save you editing time later. It's going to save you so much time. And then you're going to have all these shorts, and eventually you can just kind of casually put them up on AO3 as though you were somebody else writing fanfic about your own novel. It'll be fine. And then somebody's going to be like, well, I don't think that's very in character. And you can be like, I assure you it is. Oh, is that just my fantasy? That's just my fantasy. Sorry. So that's, I can always go more in depth into any of this, but those are the big high points. If you know kind of where you're going and what you need to get there before you write, that's great. As you write, stay consistent. Stay consistent. it's okay to not have the answers too. I don't think we talk enough about not having the answers, both as writers and as a society. This is like this greater societal problem that I'm now going to drag in this poor little meeting. But if you don't know why your character isn't going into this dark room right now, that's fine, but you're going to need to figure it out. If you aren't sure yet why the burning city is on fire and how that mechanism works, that's okay, but find out before you get there, before your characters are going down the clock to find the unicorns that are question mark, question mark. Something else I wanted to do was actually show you what some of this looks like, because there's this misconception that an outline can only look one way. that a story can only look one way, and that's absolutely untrue. So I'm going to go ahead and share an outline. And this is, I know it's too small to read, but this is a chronology that I did. So you can actually see what days things are happening, and you can tell what is happening on those days. This, as an outline, was incredibly useful to me because when this was first generated, one of these lines was like this long, and all of the rest of them were this long. And I was like, oh, we can't just make everything happen on that one day. And if I had done this chronology sooner in the process, I would definitely not have spent as much time editing later. Another way that an outline can look is this. And it is literally just crayon on paper. And I've got some dots that are, these are days. And I kind of know what events, look, there's a bunch of days in here where I don't know what's happening yet. So that's great. That was good. But having these couple of benchmarks tells me how much time I have to fill. And this was constrained by the fact that the book that we were working on was, they were traveling from point A to point B, and some things had to exist on certain days because they were connected to physically where in the journey the characters were. So this gave me a sense of how much time I had to fill, which is another sort of useful outlining point. If you know things have to happen on like Monday and then Thursday, you know if you've only got like a finite amount of time for the setup to happen for Thursday. And of course, that's super useful if you're writing like a mystery or a closed door mystery or anything with like a big, heavy deadline. If Cinderella has to get to the ball tonight and it is 10 o'clock in the morning, you've got 9 hours to get her dress put together, to find shoes, to figure out music, to get her hair done. If she has to do a bunch of side quests during that time, it's going to feel unrealistic. It's like, how did you fit all of this in a day? So temporal outlines can also help. That has actually covered everything that I wanted to talk about. So if anybody's got any questions that I somehow didn't get to while I was blathering for an hour, I am excited to hear them.
Are there, how many participants do we have here?
We've got, so there are several people in the society. Not all of them are going to be able to make every meeting. So I record. And this is month 2. So like right now we've got about 5 steady people. And then a bunch more that watch the recording later.
Okay. I don't think I have any questions at this time, really.
You can always ask in the Discord later, and I will make sure that you get answers.
I think I did have a question back when you were talking about gathering research from different cultures. Can
Sure.
you speak about that?
Yeah, so there is there's a bunch of different ways to gather research about different cultures and from within different cultures. If you're going to be writing a story that um, touches intimately is a very very awkward phrase to use, but it does touch intimately on the social aspects and the personal aspects of being in a culture that is not your own.
Okay. I
Oh
have a
goodness! Hey guys, sorry, I've got a mail. So one of the shush.
This is when I'm glad I live in an apartment so that my dogs can't see people walking around.
I know, it's horrible. We took her to a hotel once, and every time somebody walked down the hallway, she just was so stressed out. Um, so, one of the things that's really important when you're researching stuff from another culture is to look, first of all, for own voices research. Because, like, when you are reading someone who is external to the culture's speculation about what things mean, it is not going to be as, I hate to use the word authentic, it's not going to be as authentic. Um, we talked about this a lot in with a friend. I do some historical stuff, and one of the big things in the archaeology community is archaeologists will refer to a lot of things as a ritual object. If they find a lot of it and they don't know what it means, they're like, oh, this is a ritual object. And if you talk to someone from within the culture, especially if it's like an indigenous culture, I mean, there's this illusion that a lot of white educators have, certainly, that that indigenous culture in the US is over and done with, and it's absolutely not. Like right now there are 70,000 indigenous people living in the Portland metro area, from all of the tribes whose land this historically was, and they're all available if I have questions, right? Like if I wanted to write something that was set earlier. So what you end up doing is somebody's like ritual object, and then they will go to the place, and it'll be like a village 5 miles away from the archaeological dig, and somebody will be using it, and it's a spindle weight, and they all know what it is, and it's not a mystery. So coming to that as an outsider, it's easy to make something a mystery.
Okay, I get what you're saying there. I think what my concerns are as an emerging writer, and I have lived in the Portland area for over 10 years. I'm no longer in Portland right now. I was also connected with NARA, if you're familiar with NARA.
Yeah.
And NAYA, or NAYA. So I think the concern that I have is that when people generalize this sort of point too much in conversation, that a lot of confusion gets in the way of, well, what can I write about? When, particularly in fiction.
No, absolutely, absolutely.
And the thing is that another thing I'm coming up with, as you know, in my personal background, nobody knows my background. Nobody knows my personal life. Nobody knows who I grew up with, and nobody knows what my ancestry is because I haven't told them. And sometimes I feel I see a bit of defensiveness from writers in the social and citizen media, particularly when they're just in conversation. People take things personally and get into arguments because of this sort of misunderstanding.
Yeah. So just to address what can I write,
Yeah.
You can write anything. Should you write anything? No. One thing that I think that we all need to be doing as we have these conversations is, instead of making assumptions about the writer's background, about who they grew up with, about what they know, is say, is this part of your culture?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know? Is this part of your background? Especially writers who are also not from that culture or that background, and they are not necessarily going to be also best placed. Like, we have a huge problem right now where the gatekeepers in the industry are perceiving not own voices narratives as more authentic than own voices narratives, because it looks like what these people who are external to the culture expect to see from the culture. And that's an issue. It's a big issue. It's something that we are going to talk a lot more about in July, in terms of, who gets to write what and what sensitivity read do you need and who do you need to be talking to before you publish something that is written about or set in a culture that is not historically something that you are part of or that you have a gut level understanding of. And again, there's a tension, right? Because we want diversity in our books. We want a variety of people in our books. We don't want to assume somebody's gender identity because of the way they present. We don't want to assume somebody's background. I have a friend who is Black. She's very, very light-skinned. She gets pegged as, this white woman in social justice conversations all the time. People have landed on her really, really hard about that. She is not white. She did not grow up in a white family. Her parents are both much darker than she is. She recognizes that she has a tremendous amount of light-skinned privilege. And so her identity is really complicated.
So is mine. Mine. That's what I'm running this is what I'm running up against without revealing my personal life.
Yeah.
My identity is complicated. So that's why I'm asking the questions. Yeah.
It is hard. It is hard, especially for people who have complicated identities. And it's something that I certainly personally and we as a group encourage, is instead of confronting someone and saying, that's not you, or this isn't yours, or you shouldn't be writing about this, say, is this something you have a background in? Who have you talked to? What is your background in this? And then, say, and people who are not an expert should start with that, right? Like, I'm not from this culture, but this feels a little weird to me. Can you talk more about where you got it? Yeah. Instead of, jumping in confrontationally at the beginning. On the other hand, there are things that are just absolutely wildly, clearly wrong. There will be, I'm trying to anonymize this hard enough that it's never going to fall on anyone's head, because I'm very conscious right now that we're being recorded. I have an acquaintance who was asked to sensitivity read / fact check a story that was set in a very, very specific place in their homeland. And none of the stuff that happened in the story could happen in that place.
Uh-huh.
So even though this author had done a non-trivial amount of research and had traveled in that country, they had not traveled to the place this was set. And so a lot of stuff like modes of address were wrong. Some of the structure of the story was, I hate just saying blanket, this is wrong, but it was wrong, and I can't describe the ways that it was wrong without violating somebody's confidentiality.
Yeah.
But it was both on a source land and a diasporan level inauthentic.
Gotcha. I've got to I got to mute myself. I got to mute myself for a minute. So I guess I was done with that question. Yeah.
Okay. So that is definitely something that we should be thinking about, both in terms of which stories are ours to tell and which stories aren't, and in terms of confronting people about what stories they're telling. But this is another one where you talk to people early, you talk to people often, because usually by the time your story is getting published, nobody's really questioning whether you could write it or not, because you clearly have written it. The issue is that, to a certain extent, you may need to disclose some background if you run into post-publication stuff. There are a couple of magazines that I think, honestly, just hate publish stuff. I will say The Atlantic is pretty notorious. I read a couple of pieces out of The Atlantic that did not showcase the writer to their best self, and I feel like they didn't do the author any favors at all. That they kind of wanted clicks more than they wanted to protect this person or this person's story. So it's really unfortunate when that happens. So that is also another thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you do end up writing a story from more complicated parts of your identity, you may need to be prepared to disclose those more complicated parts of your identity, because it is at that point an own voice's story, and your story is authentic to that. Or at least to your experience of that. And of course, there's such a variety of experiences even within whichever culture. And I love that we're telling more of those stories. And I love that as people who are completely external to cultures are learning to step back and not tell those stories, that we are getting that variety of own voices stories, so that there isn't like a single authentic experience of being an undocumented immigrant, or of being, growing up Black in the South, or living on the south side of Chicago, which is like this hugely problematic, shorthand for being urban and Black. That we do think about that. But that is part of the thinking. You're absolutely right. That is part of the thinking that goes into, before you tell the story, how much are you comfortable revealing about yourself, and how much are you comfortable revealing through the story, and which story do you want to tell about that? And it does come up in memoir too, and you have to get that focus and figure out what that focus is going to be. And this is actually something that I didn't talk about in the bulk of the talk, but finding an editor before you start writing can be really, really useful if you're going to tell a complicated own voices story. Finding an editor who has the cultural competency to edit your story is also going to be something that you want to look at early if you are telling something that you don't want. If you're coming from a complicated racial background, a complicated ethnic background, even just a complicated abuse background, you don't want an editor who has no cultural competency with any of those things to be touching your work. So that's also something that you can do just early on to make sure that you don't get your voice edited out later. Unless anyone else has any questions, I am going to go ahead and stop recording and call this good. All right? 5, 4, 3.